breathing method. I'm nearly 80 now, which means that I was born with this injury. All my life, I've been associated with a building which stands almost directly across from Madison Square Garden. This building, which looks like a great gray prison, something out of A Tale of Two Cities, is actually a hospital, as most of you know. It is Harriet White Memorial Hospital. The Harriet White, after whom it was named, was my father's first wife, and she got her practical experience in nursing when there were still actual sheep grazing on Sheep Meadow in Central Park. A statue of the lady herself stands on a pedestal in the courtyard before the building, and if any of you have seen it, you may have wondered how a woman with such a stern and uncompromising face could have found such a gentle occupation. The motto chiseled into the statue's base, once you get rid of the Latin federal, is even less comforting. There is no comfort without pain. Thus we define salvation through suffering. Cato, if you please, or if you don't please. I was born right inside that gray stone building on March 20th, 1900. I returned there as an intern in the year 1926. 26 is old to be just starting out in the world of medicine, but I had done a more practical internship in France at the end of World War I, trying to pack ruptured guts back into stomachs that had been blown wide open, and dealing on the black market for morphine, which was often tinctured and sometimes dangerous. As with a generation of physicians following World War II, we were a bedrock practical lot of sawbones, and the records of the major medical schools show a remarkably small number of washouts in the years 1919 to 1928. We were older, more experienced, steadier. We were also wiser. I don't know, but we were certainly more cynical. There was none of this nonsense you read about in the popular medical novels, stuff about fainting or vomiting at one's first autopsy. Not after Bella Wood, where mama rats sometimes raised whole litters of ratlings in the gas-exploded intestines of the soldiers left to rot in no man's land. We had gotten all of our puking and passing out behind us. The Harriet White Memorial Hospital also figured largely into something that has happened to me 9 years after I interned there, and this is the story I want to tell you gentlemen tonight. It is not a tale to be told at Christmas, you would say, although the final scene is played out on Christmas Eve, and yet, while it is certainly horrible, it also seems to express to me all the amazing power of our cursed, doomed species. In it, I see the wonder of our will, and also its horrible, tenebrous power. Birth itself, gentlemen, is a horrid thing to many. It is the fashion now that fathers such be present at the birth of their children, and while this fashion has served to inflict many a man with a guilt which I feel they may not deserve, it is a guilt which some women use knowingly, and with almost present cruelty. It seems by and large to be a healthful, salubrious thing. Yet I have seen men leave the delivery room white and tottering, and I have seen them swoon like girls, overcome by the cries and the blood. I remember one father who held up just fine, only to begin screaming hysterically at his perfectly healthy son pushed its way into the world. The infant's eyes were open. It gave the impression of looking around, and then its eyes settled on the father. Birth is wonderful, gentlemen, but I have never found it beautiful, not by any stretch of the imagination. I believe it is too brutal to be beautiful. A woman's womb is like an engine. With conception, that engine is turned on. At first, it barely idles, but as the creative cycle nears the climax of birth, that engine revs up and up and up. Its idling whisper becomes a steady, running hum, and then a rumble, and finally a bellowing, frightening roar. Once that engine has been turned on, every mother-to-be understands that her life is in check. Either she will bring the baby forth, and the engine will shut down again, or that engine will pound louder and harder and faster until it explodes, killing her in blood and pain. This is a story of birth, gentlemen. On the eve of that birth, we have celebrated for almost 2,000 years. I began practicing medicine in 1929, a bad year to begin anything. My grandfather was able to lend me a hand and a small sum of money, so that I was luckier than many of my colleagues, but I still had to survive over the next 4 years mostly on my wits. By 1935, things had improved a bit. I developed a bedrock of steady patients and was getting quite a few outpatient referrals from White Memorial. In April of that year, I saw a new patient, a young woman whom I will call Sandra Stansfield. That name is close enough to what her real name was. This was a young woman, White, who stated her age to be 28. After examining her, I guessed her true age to be between 3 and 5 years younger than that. She was blonde, slender, and tall for that time, about 5 feet 8. She was quite beautiful, but in an austere way that was almost forbidding. Her features were clear and regular, her eyes intelligent, and her mouth every bit as determined as the stone mouth of Harriet White on the statue across from Madison Square Garden. The name she put on her form was not Sandra Stansfield, but Jane Smith. My examination subsequently showed her to be about 2 months gone in pregnancy. She wore no wedding ring. After the preliminary exam, but before the results of the pregnancy test were in, my nurse, Ella Davidson, said, "That girl yesterday, Jane Smith, if that isn't an assumed name, I never heard one." I agreed. Still, I rather admitted her. She had not engaged in the usual shrilly, toe-scuffing, blushing, tearful behavior. She had been straightforward, businesslike. Even her alias had seemed more a matter of business than shame. There had been no attempt to provide verisimilitude by creating a Betty Rucklehouse or a whopping Turina DeVille. "You require a name for your form," she seemed to be saying, "because that is the law, so here is a name. But rather than trusting to the professional ethics of a man I don't know, I'll trust in myself, if you don't mind." Ella sniffed and passed a few remarks, modern girls and bold as brass, but she was a good woman, and I don't think she said those things except for the sake of form. She knew as well as I did that whatever my new patient might be, she was no trollop with forward eyes and round heels. No, Jane Smith was merely an extremely serious, extremely determined young woman, if either of those things can be described by such a milquetoast adverb as merely. It was an unpleasant situation. It used to be called getting in a scrape, as you gentlemen may remember. Nowadays it seems that many young women use a scrape to get out of the scrape, and she meant to go through it with whatever grace and dignity she could manage. A week after her initial appointment, she came in again. That was a peach of a day, one of the first real days of spring. The air was mild, the sky a soft, milky shade of blue, and there was a smell on the breeze. A warm, indefinable smell that seems to be nature's signal that she is entering her own birth cycle again. The sort of day one wished to be miles from any responsibility, sitting opposite a lovely woman of one's own at Coney Island, maybe, or on the Palisades across from the Hudson with a picnic hamper on a checkered cloth, and the lady in question wearing a great white cartwheel hat and a sleeveless gown as pretty as the day. Jane Smith dress had sleeves, but it was still almost as pretty as the day. A smart white linen with brown edging, she wore brown pumps, white gloves, and a cloak hat that was slightly out of fashion. It was the first sign I saw that she was far from her ritual. And "You're pregnant," I said. "I don't believe you doubted it much, did you?" "If there are to be tears," I thought, "they will come now." "No," she said with perfect composure. There was no more a sign of tears in her eyes than there were rain clouds on the horizon that day. I'm very regular, as a rule. There was a pause between us. When may I expect to deliver? She asked then with an almost soundless sigh. It was the sound of a man or a woman that one might make before bending over to pick up a heavy load. It will be a Christmas baby, I said. December 10th is the date I'll give you, but it could be 2 weeks on either side of that. All right, she hesitated briefly and then plunged ahead. Will you attend me even though I'm not married? Yes, I said, on one condition. She frowned, and in that moment her face was more like the face of Harriet White than ever. One would not think that the frown of a woman perhaps only 23 could be particularly formidable, but this one was. She was ready to leave, and the fact that she would have to go through this entire embarrassing process again with another doctor was not going to deter her. And what might that be? She asked with perfect, colorless courtesy. Now it was I who felt an urge to drop my eyes from her steady hazel ones, but I held her gaze. I insist upon knowing your real name. We can continue to do business on a cash basis, if that is how you prefer it, and I can continue to have Mrs. Davidson issue you receipts in the name of Jane Smith. But if we're going to travel through the next 7 months or so together, I would like to be able to address you by the name which you answer in all the rest of your life. I finished this absurdly stiff little speech and watched her think it through. I was somehow quite sure she was going to stand up, thank me for my time, and leave forever. I was going to feel disappointment if that had happened. I liked her. Even more, I liked the straightforward way she was handling a problem, which would have reduced 90 women out of 100 to inept and undignified liars, terrified by the living clock within, and so deeply ashamed of their situation that to make any reasonable plan for coping with it become impossible. I suppose many young people today would find such a state of mind ludicrous, ugly, even hard to believe. People have become so eager to demonstrate their broad-mindedness that a pregnant woman who has no wedding ring is apt to be treated with twice the solicitude of one who does. You gentlemen will remember when the situation was quite different. You will remember a time when rectitude and hypocrisy were combined to make a situation that was viciously difficult for a woman who had gotten herself in a scrape. In those days, a married pregnant woman was a radiant woman, sure of her position and proud of fulfilling what she considered to be her function that God put her on earth for. An unmarried pregnant woman was a trollop in the eyes of the world, and apt to be a trollop in her own eyes as well. They were, to use Ella Davidson's word, easy, and in that world and in that time, easiness was not quickly forgiven. Such women crept away to have their babies in towns or cities. Some took pills, some jumped from buildings. Others were to butcher abortionists with dirty hands, or tried to do the job themselves. In my time as a physician, I have seen 4 women die of blood loss because of my eyes as a result of punctured wounds. In one case, the puncturing was done by a jagged neck of a Dr. Pepper bottle, and that had been tied to the handle of a whisk broom. It is hard to believe now that such things happened, but they did, gentlemen. They did. It was quite simply the worst situation a healthy young woman could find herself in. All right, she said at last, that's fair enough. My name is Sandra Stansfield, and she took her hand out. Rather amazed, I took it and shook it. I'm rather glad Ella Davidson didn't see me do that. She would have made no comment, but the coffee would have been bitter for the next week. She smiled at my own expression of bemusement, I imagined, and looked at me frankly. I hope we can be friends, Dr. McCarran. I need a friend just now. I'm quite frightened. I understand that, and I'll try to be your friend if I can, Miss Stanfield. Is there anything I can do for you now? She opened her handbag and took out a dime store pad and pen. She opened the pad, poised the pen, and looked up at me. For one horrified instant, I believed she was going to ask me for the name and address of an abortionist. Then she said, I'd like to know the best things to eat for the baby. I laughed out loud. She looked at me with some amazement. Forgive me, it's just that you seem so businesslike. I suppose, she said, that this baby is a part of my business now, isn't it, Dr. McCarran? Yes, of course it is, and I have a folder which I give to all my pregnant patients. It deals with diet and weight and drinking and smoking and lots of other things. Please don't laugh when you look at it. You'll hurt my feelings if you do, because I wrote it myself. And so I had, although it was really more of a pamphlet than a folder, and in time became my book, A Practical Guide to Pregnancy and Delivery. I was quite interested in obstetrics and gynecology in those days. Still am, although it's not a thing to specialize in back then unless you had 10 or 15 years to establish a strong practice. Having hung out my shingle at rather a too ripe age as a result of the war, I didn't feel I had the time to spare. I contented myself with the knowledge that I would see a great many happy expectant mothers and deliver a great many babies in the course of my general practice. And so I did. At last count, I have delivered well over 2,000 babies, enough to fill 50 classrooms. I kept up with the literature on having babies more smartly than I did on that applying to any other area of general practice. And because my opinions were strong, enthusiastic ones, I wrote my own pamphlet rather than just passing along the stale chestnuts so often foisted on young mothers then. I won't run through the whole catalog of these chestnuts. We'd be here all night, but I'll mention a couple. Expectant mothers were urged to stay off their feet as much as possible, and on no account were they to walk any sustained distance, lest a miscarriage or birth damage result. Now, giving birth is an extremely strenuous piece of work, and no such advice is like telling a football player to prepare for the big game by sitting around as much as possible so he won't tire himself out. Another sterling piece of advice given by a good many doctors was that moderately overweight mothers tended to take up smoking. Smoking! The rationale was perfectly expressed by an advertising slogan of the day, "Have a lucky instead of a sweet." People who have the idea that when we entered the 20th century we also entered an age of medical light and reason have no idea of how utterly crazy medicine could sometimes be. Perhaps it's just as well. Their hair would turn white. I gave Miss Steinfeld my folder, and she looked through it with complete attention for perhaps 5 minutes. I asked her permission to smoke my pipe, and she gave it absently, without looking up. When she did look up at last, there was a small smile on her lips. "Are you a radical, Dr. McCarran?" she asked. "Why do you say that?" "Because I advise that the expectant mother should walk her round of errands instead of riding in a smoky, jolting subway car. Prenatal vitamins, whatever they are. Swimming, recommended. And breathing exercises." "What breathing exercises?" "That comes later on. And no, I'm not a radical. Far from it. What I am is 5 minutes overdue on my next patient." "Oh, I'm sorry." She got to her feet quickly, tucking the thick folder into her purse. "No need." She shrugged into her light coat, looking at me with those dark, hazel eyes, as she did. "No," she said, "not a radical at all. I suspect you're actually quite comfortable. Is that the word I want?" "I hope it will serve," I said. "It's a word I like. If you speak to Mrs. Davidson, she'll give you an appointment schedule. I want to see you again early next month." "Your Mrs. Davidson doesn't approve of me." "Oh, I'm sure that's not true at all. But I've never been a particularly good liar, and the warmth between us suddenly slipped away. I did not accompany her to the door of my consulting room. "Miss Stansville," she turned toward me, coolly inquiring, "do you intend to keep the baby?" She considered me briefly, and then smiled. A secret smile, which I am convinced only pregnant women know. "Oh, yes," she said, and let herself out. By the end of that day, I had treated identical twins for identical cases of poison ivy. Lanced Boyle removed a hook of metal from a welder's eye, and referred one of my oldest patients to White Memorial for what was surely cancer. I had forgotten all those Sandra Stanfields by then. Ellen Davidson recalled her to my mind by saying, she's not a gyppy, after all. I looked up from my last patient's folder. I had been looking at it, feeling that useless disgust most doctors feel when they know they have been rendered completely helpless, and thinking I ought to have a rubber stamp made for such files. Only instead of saying account receivable or paid in full or patient moved, it would simply say death warrant, perhaps with a skull and crossbones above, like those on bottles of poison. Pardon me, you're Miss Jane Smith. She did a most peculiar thing after her appointment this morning. The set of Mrs. Davidson's head and mouth made it clear that this was a sort of peculiar thing of which she approved. And what was that? When I gave her appointment card, she asked me to tot up her expenses. All of her expenses. Delivery and hospital stay included. That was a peculiar thing, all right. This was 1935, remember, and Miss Stansfield gave every impression of being a woman on her own. Was she well off, even comfortably off? I didn't think so. Her dress, shoes, gloves had all been smart, but she had worn no jewelry, not even costume jewelry. And then there was her hat, that decidedly out-of-date cloak. Did you do it? I asked. Mrs. Davidson looked at me as though I might have lost my senses. Did I? Of course I did, and she paid the entire amount, in cash. The last, which apparently had surprised Mrs. Davidson the most, in an extremely pleasant way, of course, surprised me not at all. One thing which the Jane Smiths of the world can't do is write checks. Took a bank book out of her purse, opened it, and counted the money right out onto my desk. Mrs. Davidson was continuing. Then she put a receipt in where the cash had been, put the bank book into her purse again, and said good day. Not half bad when you think of the way we've had to chase some of these so-called respectable people to make them pay their bills. I felt chagrined for some reason. I was not happy with the Stansfield woman for having done such a thing, and for Mrs. Davidson for being so pleased and complacent with the arrangement, and with myself. For some reason I couldn't define then and can't now. Something about it made me feel small. But she couldn't very well pay for a hospital stay now, could she? I asked. It was a ridiculously small thing to seize on, but it was all I could find at the moment on which to express my pique and half-amused frustration. After all, none of us knows how long she'll have to remain here. Or are you reading the crystal now, Ella? I told her that very thing, and she asked what the average stay was following an uncomplicated birth. I told her 6 days. Wasn't that right, Dr. McCarran? I had to admit it was. She said that she would pay for 6 days then, and if it was longer, she would pay the difference, and if it was shorter, we could issue her a refund. I finished warily. I thought, damn the woman anyway, and then I laughed. She had guts. One couldn't deny that. All kinds of guts. Mrs. Davidson allowed herself a smile, and if I am ever tempted, now that I am in my dotage, to believe I know all there is to know about one of my fellow creatures, I tried to remember that smile. Before that day I would have staked my life that I would never see Mrs. Davidson, one of the most proper women I have ever known, smile fondly as she thought about a girl who was pregnant out of wedlock. Guts, I don't know, Doctor, but she knows her own mind, that one. She certainly does.